Hema decked up today or no?
I'm not serving up margarita. So it's plain Jane Hema today.
But why are you sitting in darkness?
Yeah, I was just going to ask. You're shrouded in darkness.
Oh, hi, Murli.
I'll switch on a few lights.
Anyway, also Hema, the nation wants to know why is Shibu's chair facing the road and why is Hema chair facing the wall?
Shibu.
Wall
Okay.
and window. We can't see any window.
Can you see my screen?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah,
Yes.
we can see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start. This was the topic that I chose, exploring the magic of Malgudi. I think I was taking a walk with Rani when suddenly this image of that, I mean, not image, the sounds of that El Vaidyanathan tune, ta na 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 na,
Yeah.
somehow came into my head. And then one thing led to the other. And I said, hey, Malgudi, and then I sort of went back to those days. Okay.
Mute.
Now, as I grew up, I actually prided myself on the fact that I was a voracious reader of fiction in my growing years. And I used to sort of, quote unquote, brag about it.
Audio.
Can you see? Can you see?
Yeah,
this? Yeah. So having plowed through all of Enid Blyton, Biggles, Jeeves, and then growing up to Perry Mason, Agatha Christie, then graduating to Chase, and then to more serious fiction, Robin Cook, Ken Follett, Grisham, you have, whatever you have, Ludlum, etc.
Harold Robbins.
Yeah, and yes, a Stone for Danny Fisher to make you cry. Yet I missed discovering a literary giant. And I feel ashamed that till as late as 1986, and I was past 30, till our good old Doordarshan introduced him to me. It's delightful. See the detail of the statue. We'll talk about some of them. Look at the town.
This guy is singing. Raja. Sounds okay.
Okay, let's rewind a bit to the beginnings. It's nearly 91 years ago. The year 1930 is actually when that witnessed the breakthrough creative event in our writer's life. In September of that year, on the auspicious day of Vijayadashami, selected by his grandmother, who spent a lot of time looking after him, he opened a new exercise book and waited for inspiration to strike. And this he says in his autobiography called My Days. After writing his first line, and his first line he ever wrote for this book in 1930, the story was, "It was Monday morning." He says he wrote that line and he stared at empty space, but he visualized a small railway station. And according to him, the name seemed to hurl into view and Malgudi was born. So romantic, so charming. And then it took many years before this got officially published. That was the time Swami and Friends was written by him in 1930. But it took till 1942 before a compendium of short stories in a simple South Indian town was written, and it was called Malgudi Days. The fictional town was Malgudi. The writer, Rasipuram Krishnaswamy Narayanan, like all of us South Indians, would you believe my name is Hariharan Venkata Subramaniam, which became H.V. Subramaniam, which then got added to my call name Prasad and became Prasad Subramaniam. So Prasad Subramaniam really doesn't exist on any official records. So RK Narayan he became from Rasipuram Krishnaswamy Narayan. Its readers were entranced. RK went on to write many, many more stories set in this town called Malgudi. Malgudi, readers were curious. Some claimed it was inspired by Bangalore. Some who knew of RK's history of having lived in Mysore, studied in Mysore, thought it was inspired by Mysore. Yet others with a more careful understanding of Karnataka thought it was inspired by Agumbe. The writer, of course, said it was an imaginary place and you will never find it on any map. And actually, Malgudi was a portmanteau of two Bangalore localities, Malleshwaram, accounting for the Mal, and Basavangudi, accounting to the Gudi. So Malgudi comes from Malleshwaram and Basavangudi. All but one of his 15 novels and almost all his many short stories are set in Malgudi. And the beauty of the whole thing, if you have read some of his work or even looked at commentaries which analyzed his work, is that the author portrayed Malgudi as a microcosm of India, and he very successfully did that. A little more about Malgudi and the speculations, and if people who have read all of it seem to be able to describe it almost as if it's a neighboring town that you have visited, located on the banks of the fictional river Sarayu, near the also fictional Mempi forest bordering Mysore and Madras, and they claim this place is much closer to Madras than to Bangalore or Mysore. It has a street, central street called Market Street. Many things have happened there in many of his stories. And it's a location of several big shops, including Bombay Anand Bhavan and Truth Printing Works. And for readers, some of these bring back great memories, and you start visualizing the town. Lawley Extension is a new upcoming lane which housed the rich and the influential. Ellamman Street was home to the oil mongers, and that's the last street, because after that came the Sarayu River. And in that picture that I showed you, there's this famous statue, illustrated, of course, by his illustrious brother, RK Lakshman, the statue of Sir Frederick, seated on a horse, and that is a major landmark in the town, keeps popping up when he describes activity in the town. And he went on to say, in his words, RK said, if Socrates or Plato were alive, they would have felt at home in Sayaji Rao Road and would have carried on their dialogues at the station square. So it was all, to me, it was also memories of Calcutta, where under a tree, the Bhadralok used to, at evening 7 o'clock, not worried about anything else, whether there's electricity or home, but they used to have an adda about politics. And I think that's what RK meant, that these are places which would further discussion of topics ranging from simple to the difficult. Well as Malgudi's landmarks of Nallappa Grove, Albert Mission School, Regal Haircutting Saloon, and sure enough, they had their own MCC, Malgudi Cricket Club, because don't forget the effect of the English period in which it was all written. Cricket was obviously going to be featured well. And Palace Talkie Cinema, it was Narayan's irreverent portrait of its wonderful residents that opened the door to a faraway world. In this curious universe, the middle-aged moneylender, Margaya, he had an office that was a little more than a chair and an old tin box under a banyan tree. Even today, actually, when you drive down to semi-urban India, many of these images are no longer part of the past. They continue to live in today's India. The physician vet, Dr. Joshi, treated humans and animals with the same medicine. So many lovely stories we hear of how this vet treats humans with the same medicine that he gives animals. The portly postman, Thannappa, with inch-thick spectacles, Soda Buddhi, he knew the address of every citizen and the ups and downs of their fortune. So here are postmen who carry good news, bad news, frustrating news, happy news. And you know, they're so involved, and I must digress here for a minute. I was anxiously waiting for my IIM entrance because my friend had a father's friend in Ahmedabad who told him on Friday that finally it's come, you've got the admission. And I was waiting, and I had whole week I had spent chasing the postman, this Iyengar postman who came on a cycle in Madras. And on Monday morning, he saw me waiting outside my home, which was at the end of the long street. He saw me at the other end of the street. He skipped all the homes in between, signaling one envelope to me, saying, so, you know, the postman was as involved in whether I was going to get into IIM Ahmedabad or not. Well, life in Malgudi moved at a slow pace. Narayan painted a beguiling picture of people gossiping. They sat under flickering oil-fired street lamps, eating delicious meals of large banana tree leaves, or at times they were lazing in hammocks looped over tree branches. So you can get the sense of the kind of town, small town India, but this was very real. And people who read reveled in the fact that they could have just stepped out and they could have stepped into Malgudi. Malgudi was brought to life on television, as I showed you in that clip. And there's that statue. That is Master Manjunath, who played Swami and his friends. That's a house where Swami lived. These were some of his friends in the photograph down. That's some lovely waterfall at Agumbe. It was a brilliant serial. I think kudos goes to Shankar Nag for having sort of translated a lot of the thoughts and the stories and the writings into a television script. And of course, Girish Karnad featured in it along with Swami and the group of guys. And the serial, for those who haven't seen it, is still available on Disney Hotstar. Well, fiction and fact do blur. The Arasalu station on the Shimoga-Talaguppa railway line in Karnataka has, as of 2019 December, been renamed as Malgudi. This was a request by the Rajya Sabha MP of Shimoga, who said Arasalu, which was also the set location for the TV show, started getting more and more identified. A bit like this Rampur Hill where Sholay was shot, it became a tourist spot. People still trek up to that hill to see whether they can spot some remains of Gabbar and his team. So Arasalu now today is called Malgudi. The railways opened a Malgudi museum near the station. So in future, when you go to Malgudi station, let us know if you spot a small boy called Swami running down the platform. You'll probably identify him because he's a very puny little fellow, small height, looks very innocent, and generally looks completely disinterested in anything to do with school, education, and school books. And even if you don't actually take the railway trip to Arasalu, just crack open the book that you may have of Malgudi days or buy it at Amazon and let the pages transport you to Malgudi. After all, as I think, Malgudi is a state of mind. It doesn't have to exist physically, but with all the characters and all the things that we know about the town, the moment you start reading the stories, Malgudi comes alive to you. Well, where did it all begin in terms of conceptualization? So much about Malgudi specifically and the curiosity it evokes. A lot of critics compare Narayan's Malgudi with Thomas Hardy's Wessex or William Faulkner's Yoknapatwa Pa. These were all, both these authors created towns from their own experiences, their own childhood, their upbringing, and then created people. And like RK did, it had people that he met every day. So they were very, very real. And actually, in the words of Graham Greene, who was actually a mentor for RK Narayan, and he almost worshipped the kind of writing that RK Narayan did, in spite of the fact that Graham Greene was such a famous writer. He said Malgudi was a place where you could go into those loved and shabby streets and see with excitement and a certainty of pleasure a stranger who's approaching you past the bank, past the cinema, past the haircutting saloon, a stranger who will greet us. We don't know him, but he will greet us. We know with some unexpected and revealing phrase that will open the door to yet another human existence. So Graham Greene thought this was full of possibilities. This is what would happen to you if you were trying to sort of get into and he thought this is the beauty of this place. I could go and discover another human existence and I could see another life. A bit about the historical context in which all this was written. Swami and Friends, as I said, was written in the 30s, was between the First and the Second World Wars. And therefore, as you can see, it was a literary period of a fair amount of creative experimentation, and that obviously encouraged Narayan in his mission. He wanted to create a uniquely personal, comedic depiction of the childhood that he remembered. So he just wanted it to be very, very personal. So we'll analyze in a little while some of his literary tools or ammunition which made him do what he did. But just to get the context right, the historical context of the British colonial rule is also crucial to the story, and it pops up in many ways. As Swami and his friends begin to comprehend the oppression of their country, so there are references to the fact that we are living under colonial rule. Simultaneously, they're growing up to love certain aspects of England, in particularly the sport of cricket, and the kind of joy that urchins have on the streets throughout India, even today when you travel. That street cricket, that hurriedly put together, assembled set of stumps. There are no regular stumps, but maybe a few stones. So all of that is part of that life, because that's a historical context. We were under British rule. Britain would continue to rule India until late 40s. So Swami just witnesses the stirrings of the independence movement. And there are some stories in part of Swami and his friends' stories, which refer to that or take you there. A little bit about the writer. We have understood Malgudi, we have understood some historical context. Let's try and get a peep into Rasipuram Krishna Swami Narayan. Born into a middle-class Tambram family in Madras, he cared largely of his grandmother in Madras. That's because his father was a headmaster and used to have a transferable job. So his father and mother used to sort of leave him in the care of his grandmother. Way back in 1934, Narayan broke with tradition when they were proposing an arranged marriage. He put his foot down and he wanted to marry a girl whom he had met in Coimbatore when he was there with his grandmother, when he was living there. And he got married to her. Of course, sadly, he lost his wife just 5 years after marriage. And that was a huge, deeply influenced some of his later sort of writings in terms of his ability to comment on the lighter side of things, along with a more deeper introspection of life. He raised his only daughter, Hema, on his own, and he never remarried. In fact, she died of cancer 6-7 years before he died. He spent a fair amount of time living with her in Chennai, with her and her husband. So other than writing, he also became an activist for causes including environmentalism and children's rights. All of us remember that his famous speech in the Rajya Sabha when he fought for school children having to lug many kilos of school books, and in that speech and whatever he fought for in Parliament became much talked about. He spent close to 2 decades at a house in an upper middle class neighborhood in Mysore. And some people noted that while it was, he had become by then famous, he was reasonably, I wouldn't say wealthy, but he was reasonably very well off. And, but he lived with very modest means. The only indulgence he afforded himself was a blue Mercedes car. In those days, with some special government permission, without duties, he had a Mercedes car, which he used to love driving around in Mysore, but otherwise reasonably modest living. The Narayan home was a trilingual household even back then. Tamil was spoken within the house. Kannada was spoken socially with all the friends in and around, having spent so many years in Mysore. While correct English usage became almost a family obsession. And one of the reasons English was pursued was all the children, and he had many siblings, not all of them became famous, RK Lakshman and one other, Chinu Srinivasan, became he became something of note. Nothing is known about the other siblings. They all had access to his father being headmaster of a school, continuous access to a good library. And Narayan used to spend many, many hours in the library trying to sort of learn new things and exposing himself to literature of all kinds. But as I said, having written Swami and Friends in 30, it took a long while before he was going to become anywhere into getting published. There was no question of getting published in India because there was no Indian author writing in English in those days. So it had to be published abroad. And his escape from obscurity in Mysore was actually aided by a neighbor who went to study in Oxford. And he made it his mission in life to say, I'm going to get Narayan published. And after many failed attempts, he brought Narayan to Graham Greene. And the rest is history, because Graham Greene was so fascinated by what Narayan wrote, and he worked closely with him and made sure that his first 3 novels found British publishers. And that was where the beginning was made. And then the rest, of course, one thing led to the other. His popularity increased. He went on to get published in other countries, including his My Days was widely acclaimed in the United States, where it was published. and then, of course, in many, many other languages. So Graham Greene it was to whom he owes his first sort of leap into publishing internationally. Now, nominated more than once for the Nobel Prize in Literature, he never won it. Like Graham Greene too has never won a Nobel. But Narayan was well awarded within the country. He was first awarded the Padma Bhushan and then the Padma Vibhushan. The Padma Vibhushan, as you all know, just under the Bharat Ratna, is still very, very rare, and Narayan was one of the recipients. And of course, he received many global awards from literary societies in England, USA, rest of Europe, etc. And we must sort of take our hats off to this writer who, because finally Narayan was one of the earliest Indian novelists to write exclusively in English about everyday life in India. And in many ways, he paved the way for generations of Indian writers who we all today read and enjoy their writing, and the fact that they write in English. India has produced a reasonable, I wouldn't say outstanding, but some of them are my personal favorites. I just love, whether it's Amitabh Ghosh or any of those. So in many ways, the forerunner 91 years ago was Narayan, who probably paved the way for this generation of Indian writers to do the same. Now, this is the important part. All this is well, he did that. Is this a fluke? What, did he have a method? What is a writer's ammunition? Every writer has not just a style, not just a stamp of his kind of writing, but he uses some technique. If there is something called technology in writing, or there is a core discipline that the writer commits himself to, and I tried understanding that based on some research. When I first read him after the Doordarshan serials, I didn't know most of these things, but thanks to this session, I've discovered the writer in him far, far more and less superfluously, in a little more depth. So I came across this famous quotation by Robert Louis Stevenson, and it applies in the case of Narayan. R.L. Stevenson said, "There is but one art, to omit." There is but one art, to omit. And he went on to say, "Oh, if I knew how to omit, I would ask no other knowledge." Wanting to be a writer, R.L. Stevenson. "A man who knows how to omit would make an Iliad of a daily paper," said he. Now it's relevant because all of Narayan's writing testifies to this secret knowledge. This was one of his primary ammunition. And it comes across again and again. I have used only some references here. On one, he was asked a question on how he had managed to create complex and fascinating books without relying on long narration. And that is a hallmark of Narayan. There will be simple sentences, simple words, very complex stories, but very fascinating. It doesn't have to go on and on. He doesn't need one paragraph to describe something. He'll probably do it in 3 lines. And to this question, Narayan said, "I always blue pencil anything that seems at all repetitive." So he abhorred repetition, and he did write and rewrite looking at all his blue pencil marks and ruthlessly chopped things that were not necessary. I'm reminded of Steve Jobs, another idol of mine. And I'm told that the Jonathan Ive, who is the designer of all Apple products, all the laptops, the phone, the iPod, the original iPhone, when Jonathan Ive took it to Steve Jobs at least 12 times when he thought the product was ready to go. And each time Steve Jobs asked him, "Why do you need this? Why do you need that?" And finally, he was left with just the home button on the phone. And he said, that's good enough. And it was at the 12th instance, Jonathan Ive managed to. And Steve Jobs' only thing was what is not required for delivery of both the product and whatever emotion, the joy of having an iPhone. In his view, this whole thing of keep looking for what you can knock off. So that whole minimalistic approach in the case of Apple. And in the case of Narayan's writing, it was all to do with it's not required. I can communicate it without that. And I remember a letter that Graham wrote to him when he was trying to get him published. And in a letter to him, he said, "You know, Narayan, if we fail to get this published, it will be chiefly because of its length. 50,000 words is awkwardly short for a novel." He thought maybe 75,000 words was required. Narayan, of course, Graham Greene agreed that this is a racket amongst publishing houses, but if you don't play by the rules, then you're not going to get published. Narayan said, so be it. I'm not going to write. He never broke that credo of his. So this sort of secret weapon or knowledge that he implemented, which is the art of omission. Now, the second tripod on which his whole writing rested, which is plenitude of material. And this is fascinating because Ved Mehta, in an interview in New York, once asked him, was he ever oppressed by a sense of diminishing literary powers? You know, you're growing old, and do you think you're unable to write with the same copiousness, with the same, do you have enough subjects? And it's amazing what RK Narayan said. He said, I really have more stories that I can write in a lifetime. And probably in the next Janma, I will not be an author, I'll be a publisher. How nice it would be to live in Malgudi. So he said, the amount, the material available to a story writer in India is limitless. So he clearly believed on this whole variety that India offered in its small towns. And he said, within a broad climate of inherited culture, there are many variations. It is very stimulating for me to live in a society that is not standardized or mechanized. We have so many currents and undercurrents crossing each other, and we are not a mechanized society with a set of rules. We seem to invent rules that suit subgroups and subcommunities by the month. And therefore, we are free from monotony. And therefore, he felt that this whole plenitude of material, which is really the fuel for him to write more, under such conditions, he says the writer only has to look out of the window and I can pick up a character and write a story. Not very different from how Graham Greene felt that you could just dive into Malgudi as a town and you would meet a character who can then, you can write a story on. The third leg of the tripod of what I call his literary ammunition was spontaneity and non-deliberateness. Narayan placed a high value on spontaneity. And actually, if you read his stories, even if you don't read the actual novel, I will at the end of the session give you some gist of some short stories which he wrote, and you can see the idea, and some of it is sort of so spontaneous in the way he conceives the idea and the writing. And there is what we can call a non-deliberateness in fiction. So any knowledge of his fiction will show that he's the most unself-conscious of writers. He himself explained that you could argue that I'm just putting pen and the pen is writing on its own. Yeah, you could argue I'm letting things run their course, meaning I'm not starting with a pre sort of structured mind saying these are all the 10 things about this character and I must use this, I must do that. He doesn't follow that sort of discipline, which he called a deliberateness. He was not criticizing people who use that method. But he said, in my writings, these characters just surface and ideas develop without my overthinking or over deliberating what are the 10 things they should do and what are the 10 things they should not do. So this is the third leg of the three things. And I think beyond these three, and I'm calling them roots, beyond the art of omission, plenitude of material, and the non-deliberateness in writing, literary mastery came, in his own words, from a sense of being very rooted. And those roots is what he thinks gave his writing so much life. Rooted in culture, rooted in values, society, family. And he once said that, when he was commenting on another writer's book, he said, it's very well written. He uses good language and stories are good, but he seems to lack roots. And then when he was probed is where he made this point that being rooted in culture and values and family is very critical. Few younger writers of Indian origin have subsequently commented negatively that his writing was pedestrian, metronomic, and impoverished. I'm just placing them here because just to give you the balanced view that some people thought that it was very sort of very, very pedestrian and very matter of fact, there wasn't too much depth, etc. But I think there is no second opinion on how tall he stands in the literary world. He can be read all the world. And some minus writers and critics have acknowledged the quality and the value of this whole simplicity that we have spoken of. Here are some tributes, very rich tributes and acclaims. Graham Greene said, since the death of Evelyn Waugh, Narayan is the novelist I most admire in the English language. And that is a tall claim coming from somebody like Graham Greene. John Updike said, Narayan's ability to convey the colorful teeming of his fictional town places him in the Dickensian tradition. Wow. V.S. Naipaul, another wonderful author, who of course had his own kind of writing in certain kind of subjects. He was another idol. Narayan was his favorite author. He said, the life of small men, small schemes, big talk, limited means, that's Narayan for me. Anthony Lucas described him as a little like a highly intelligent bird. And Anatole Broyard said, in the Narayan world, the streets are a never-ending theater, and your neighbor's life is a fat novel, which you are sometimes invited to revise. This is so true if you read any of Narayan's short stories. Some of these words, that your neighbor's life is a fat novel and the streets are never-ending theater, actually come home to you as you read any of his stories. Since the time RK set the path, world-renowned writers of Indian origin have dealt with imaginative themes in very diverse ways, and most of us around the table here have read many of these Indian authors, have loved the way they have presented their ideas in diverse ways, in varied voices, different styles, Arvind Adiga, Amitabh Ghosh, and a host of others. You can take your pick of the worldview, you can take your pick of the approach, the theme, the narrative technique, style. It's a free literary world. But I think in the midst of all this, while it's very different from what today we probably read, Narayan's work stands tall for me. It's unpretentious, yet original. It's understated, yet path-breaking. It's non-deliberate, accessible, yet I find it philosophical and very profound. I'm going to read just 3 short stories, not the story. I'm just going to give you the gist of the story because it'll tell you how the man thought. There's no time to actually read a full short story. We'll have to reserve that for another session where we read and discuss a book like a movie. But just let's go through this. This is about an astrologer's day, another favorite. I think it was covered in Malgudi days in the 2nd or 3rd episode. This is a short story about an astrologer who knows nothing about stars or astrology. Many such people roam the streets of small town India who pretend to be experts, and there are many quacks who in fact pretend to be medical specialists. He applied for the job after going on the run to be, and he never explains why he ran away from wherever he ran away, but he applies for a job where he's supposed to sell his wares. The town people believe his predictions because he's a very shrewd guesswork. I mean, he practiced, he observed people, he heard stories from others in the town and therefore used it in trying to appear very knowledgeable about the past of some people. And one day, a customer bets a very large amount of money. The astrologer can't reveal anything of substance because the customer said, I'm giving you the large amount of money and you tell me now about me, both my past and my future. So the astrologer finds that this guy, I don't know, and I recognize the man, he's called Guru Nayak, but he resists the bet until he suddenly looks close and realizes, hey, I know this guy, he's Guru Nayak. And after some haggling, the astrologer tells the man he had been stabbed and left for dead in a well. That is a stunning story from the past for this man who came as a customer, this Guru Nayak. So the impressed customer pays up, and the astrologer warns him not to travel to this part of the country again. This could be dangerous, so leave the town. But he seemed to have pulled this remarkable incidents out of this customer's life, which clearly convinced the customer that this must be really an A-class astrologer. That night, the astrologer's wife asks, where had he been so late? And he confesses that this man who came as a customer was somebody he had tried to kill many years ago. So no wonder he knew that he had been stabbed and left for dead in a well. And this is an excerpt from that on page 12. A knife has passed through you once, said the astrologer. Good fellow, this Guru Nayak said. He bared his chest for the star. What else? And he's no more. So it's one kind of story that he wrote. This is Thannappa. Remember I referred to Thannappa who sat in the square under the statue talking. He knew everybody's life because as postman, This is the story of the missing mail. This is a story about Tannappa, the postman who always talks to the people on his road. He delivered to a man named Ramanujam from before his daughter was born to the time she is of marrying age. So he's been delivering to this Ramanujam's family, and he knows everybody in the town. He knows their history, their new child is born, the lives. And therefore, after the last marriage prospect for this girl, who's now of marrying age, Ramanujam's daughter, after that prospect falls through, Thannappa recommends a suitor in a faraway town. The meeting goes well, and everybody is rushing to get the wedding done by May 20th. Most of these dates are very sacrosanct, and people would say that if it is delayed by even one day, the groom has to go for training somewhere, and for 3 years he can't get married. So you can imagine the pressure on Ramanujam and the rest of the people, because everybody in the town believes that they are related, and the whole town goes for this wedding. So after the wedding, Thannappa reveals a postcard to Ramanujam about the death of a relative, which should have been delivered on May 20th. Thannappa did not want to disrupt the wedding, even though hiding the letter would cost him his job as a postman. Ramanujam then says he will not issue a complaint. So he sort of hides the bad news to allow the wedding to take place. That's how involved this postman was in the lives of people in the town. So that's another charming story. And now the last one, this is the doctor's word. There are many, many. I just randomly picked 3, not that these are more special than some of the others. It's so easy to pick any and they'll be very fine. This is a story about one Dr. Raman, who by time and tradition is only called for life and death situation. And that's how he was a specialist who would come when people were really on their deathbed. As such, he believes pleasant lies can't save lives. So he was firmly of the opinion that I must tell the truth. I can't save lives by just lying to a patient. He's very staunch about this. Now, suddenly his best friend Gopal falls terribly ill. After treating him for a while, the doctor privately thinks that Gopal has 1 in 1,000 chance of surviving. But his chances are worse the more he exerts himself. So between the odds of his surviving will become even more distant if he stresses himself and creates more anxiety, even worrying about whether he will survive. So Gopal begs the doctor to tell him if he will make it. Will I survive, doctor? If not, I have to sign my will, and there I have to create will. So as it is, he's getting agitated, discussing this issue of will he survive. Raman can't bear to tell Gopal the truth. But, this whole dilemma, because he's never done that. He's never lied to his patient, but this is a friend, and he can't let him keep straining himself. So he sort of justifies to himself that by telling him the truth, probably, he will keep straining, and then his odds of surviving will become even worse. So using that as a sort of factor for breaking his own self-set rules, he tells Gopal he'll be fine. And the next morning onwards, Gopal's health is splendid. And the doctor, and there's a bunch of things happening there, but just to summarize it, the doctor says survival will puzzle him for the rest of his life. So that was RK's ending to this doctor's word. So that's it. I'm now going to stop screen share. That's the end of my presentation. We can now, what do I have to do to stop sharing your screen sharing? Stop screen share. Okay. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Wow, very nice.
Very nice.
Fantastic.
I wanted to share something.
Yep.
Growing up in North India, our knowledge about what happened in the south of India was very, very limited. Limited to a couple of weeks of summer holidays once in 2 years, if you're lucky. And that goes in meeting relatives. Sometimes you have a marriage function to attend. Invariably, it's some marriage which is planned during summer vacation that you come for, and then you don't get to see life outside your relatives.
Yeah.
RK Narayan was the window to South India for somebody like me, though I'm basically a South Indian who grew up and culturally more tuned to what happens in the north and east of India.
Right.
This was a big window to what happened in the narrow lanes, villages, and streets of South India. And the second comment is, you mentioned about Malgudi days on the TV. It changed the perception of South Indians for many of my classmates. the common way that South Indians would get addressed, irrespective of which state and they came from or language they spoke, was Madrasi. There are still people in my school group in WhatsApp who, when they want to ask an opinion from me or haven't heard from me in the group for a while, Madrasi kya bol raha hai? Ya lungi wala kya bol raha hai? These are the two ways they address. I think RK Narayan brought out a picture which made people from the north of India's respect people who came from the south in terms of their values, the culture. The beauty of his writing was, even though it was picturized on Malgudi, which is a South Indian town, it touched those important value tenets across the country. People related to it. I didn't have a friend who didn't like Malgudi days, even though it was overtly South Indian, as far as the picturization was concerned.
I was in an industry which used to track TRPs, not the dubious TRPs of today, but way back, TRPs have been part of our lives to sell programs to clients to place advertising in. And what the point you made now is really what remarkably surprised us. We thought when the serial first came out in 1986, it would have a limited audience because people may not identify with it being very regionally sort of focused. But surprisingly, it got pan-Indian views and very high TRPs across, and the pattern was not regional. So you absolutely support what you said. I've seen numbers which prove that over 2 years.
I was too young to know about TRPs then. I was in probably 5th standard or 4th standard, if I recollect. But I know how.
What you said first.
The sense of respect and a few other South Indians in the Kendriya Vidyalaya that we studied received after that. It showed us in good light. And I guess parents from middle class families enjoyed this, and they drove home those values that were practiced in the South among the children in those families, which helped in greater bonding that happened. And these are all byproducts of the style and the way it was picturized by Shankar Nag and the way.
I deeply regret the fact that I didn't read or see any of this when I was actually much younger. I mean, it's a shame to start reading Narayan when you're 30. All the joys that you got of young, it would have been great. But I guess in the days we were growing up, looking for English fiction literature, really, you didn't even know that there were English authors who were writing, and you grabbed the nearest Enid Blyton and made tons and tons of Enid Blyton, and then grew up to Biggles, and then whatever else came. But it's a pity that nobody showed us the way to say we could have been looking for Indian authors who write.
I think we had 1 or 2 stories of his in different classes in the English textbooks, so it was not totally unfamiliar. And the school library had, I think, Swami and Friends, so it was not too bad.
Yeah, but you belong to a generation much later than mine. We didn't have it.
I agree.
I had it in college first year, English honors. I had it as a whole text, RK Narayan's books, starting from short stories to Malgudi days to the guide, everything.
Yeah.
Maneater of Malgudi.
And I just want to say one thing. While it is typically South Indian, in fact, it reminds me of Baswangudi. Baswangudi in the 70s and 80s, a simple, innocent life, those lovely tree-lined boulevards and things like that. But as far as saying that it is typically South Indian and that it may not appeal to people from other parts, I would disagree with that. The names are South Indian, I accept, but it is finally human life, human character. They are typical types. And I think each of these types is available. The astrologer who cons, Mar Gaya in financial expert. He's a financial conman. So all these types, I think, exist all over India, and they exist all over the world. And so I think they will strike a chord, they will resonate with people across the world. You just take out the names. For people like me who know Bangalore and Mysore very well, I mean, when you talk about Sayaji Rao Road, there is a Sayaji Rao Road in Mysore. It's the most, populous, and it's a shopping center. I would actually picture him, walking down and things like that.
Yeah.
But I think on the whole, there is something very, very universal about Narayan. It is a simple, innocent life. They're basically archetypes of, various types of character, and it is really lovely. So yeah,
that's precisely the simplicity and the usage of minimal words actually helped the North Indian guys come closer to understanding and appreciating this. If it were laden more, other than the names, more with things that are deeply South Indian, they would have taken an aversion to this. And the Malleshwaram Basavanagudi combination, this is the first time I'm hearing that.
That's how Malgudi.
Basavanagudi has changed a lot. The demography has changed. A lot of things have changed. Like, I don't know Malleshwaram very well, but Basavanagudi I've always loved. And you can, in fact, in some of those Malgudi days, the serial, there are actually houses that I know in Basavanagudi.
Yeah.
One of them is very much like a friend's house over there. So, so it maybe resonates a little more with me, but it is, terribly universal.
Prasad, I must thank you for that. Absolutely. I've had this foolish grin on my face throughout your talk. I was just enjoying it so much because it took me back to both the books and the serial. So thanks. I mean, that was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I enjoyed putting it together because I learned a lot more about the man, his writings, etc. Though I was a big sort of fan of his writing, but I sort of went beyond the superfluous this time.
Sometimes Prasad, a teacher can inspire you to read novels. I went to a school where I had my English teacher. I remember Ramanan. May God bless him. He was a fan of RK Narayan. So when I was in my 9th and 10th grade, he used to read the short stories. And the environment of my school, I went to Rishi Valley. So the whole environment was very much like what Malgudi might have been, tree lined and stone and brick, hostels and classrooms and all that. So we used to have these, benches outside under a banyan tree. So he would sit there and he would read to us. And that was the way of kind of seeding in the reading habit. And then, of course, we used to have a library as well. But he used to read and then he used to ask us to imagine, can you imagine yourself in a scene like this? What would you do? So I think it's a very interesting way of getting children to try and understand writing. And because the environment was so similar in terms of rural setting or a small town setting that it became more evocative. Right. But of course, he read only the short stories. We didn't do the novels because those were far too complicated for us at that age.
Correct.
So I had a Sri Lankan Tamil elderly gentleman as my neighbor, who was a bachelor all his life, and I spent a lot of time with him. And he was a big fan of RK Narayan.
Okay.
And he made me read many of his short stories, much beyond what was there in the school library. How many siblings were there? I knew only about Lakshman and Narayan, but
no, there are 6 or 7 of them. I forget the exact number.
They're 15 years born, 15 years apart. Lakshman and
I mean, given the periodicity with which they used to produce, they can't be 15 years apart and be just 2 children. Ravi, you had something? You raised your hand, Ravi?
Yeah, it took me back to, there were 2 foolish faces here. If Murli was one, I think Ravi was the other one. We had English as a specialization in order to qualify become a TGT, a trained graduate teacher. And one of the books for reference was Malgudi days. But in those days, colleges, mid 70s, how much of reading would you like to do? When there is everything else happening, a co-ed college in Mysore. And there would be these inter-house competitions. So our batch of students actually put up something called Malgudi days as a takeoff on Malgudi. And strangely, what happened was that sort of created a spiral of other students wanting to, what Malgudi? Where did this come from? Malgudi days. So our juniors and all started buying Malgudi days as a book. And it was so it took me back to those days. So I have a suggestion. I don't know whether it's practical with the kind of research and everything that you have done. Maybe like we have Binny's Lane, we should have Prasad's Quarter or something in this session. Every session, give him 15 minutes. Maybe he can start off with, there was another serial, remember? Wagle Ki Duniya?
Yeah.
Next one, Wagle Ki Duniya mein bhi thoda aise padhai kara lo.
Wagle Ki Duniya, Mungeri Lal ke
Hasin Sapne.
Anokhe Sapne.
Even Nukkad used to be very nice.
Yeah. And there's this lady that Priya Tendulkar played.
Yeah,
Rajini.
Prasad, really fantastic here. Very lovely presentation.
But we haven't had a Narayan after Narayan. That's the sad part.
Sorry?
What is that?
We haven't had a Narayan like after a Narayan.
Yeah.
Or even before in English at least.
Yeah.
He was one of the first to write English.
It's sad that he never got a Nobel or didn't get it, because maybe his writing must have been deemed too simple and too kind of.
The country recognized him. I mean, Padma Vibhushan is no.
I know.
Not a small thing.
But with all kinds of strange fellows getting the Nobel, you would have thought that a person like him would have.
We can take solace in the fact that Graham Greene also never got the Nobel.
That's true.
One interesting thing that I noticed that when you said about those different points which made his stories so well loved, very similar kind of thing came up in a book I was reading by Somerset Maugham. He's written a book called The Summing Up, which is a kind of looking back on his life and what he thinks are the most important things. And while talking about writing, in fact, two of the key things that he mentions is, one is this, what you said, cutting down. So simplify your sentences and write the most simple and elegant sentence that you can use. Avoid using all these fancy words and all that. So the simple sentences about things which you have personally experienced. So when you have lived a thing or seen a person, interacted with him, if you write about that, a reader is much more likely to gel with that. So I think that's what this whole thing is about. So Mom is also like that. He describes things so beautifully with simple sentences.
The only other writer I've seen similar, I've read Naguib Mahfouz, the Egyptian author and Nobel laureate. And having lived in Cairo for 5 years, I mean, some of his novels, when you read it and you saw the streets of Cairo, you found a lot of resonance between what Narayan had written about Malgudi and what Naguib Mahfouz had written about Egypt and life in Egypt, especially in the Delta and in the Aswan area. Very, very interesting. Again, same, but of course, his was originally in Arabic. I read only the English translation, so I don't know. I was told that the English translation is a bit of an apology for what was the original Arabic, but he was in the similar genre, everyday lives of people and the Egyptian culture, the mindset, the thinking. So I was in fact advised when I was posted to Egypt. One of my colleagues told me, he says, read a novel of Naguib Mahfouz for you to understand how the Egyptian thinks.
Actually, the simplistic nature of his writing, Shibu, as Sujaya mentioned, made it universal. And that's precisely the reason that his work has been published in so many languages across the world. If it had veered a little more towards expanding what he wanted to mention there in those short stories, or even culturally a little deeper into where he came from and where the settings were, it would probably have lost that universal appeal, is what I think. I remember Malgudi Days serial meant the next day there was a discussion in school among us on what happened in the previous episode. And the prior night's episode, people would discuss that. It was that universal. And I'm talking of Odisha, which is not anywhere close to South India.
Correct.
I think, a lot of credit should also go to RK Lakshman. I can't think of any other illustrator who's captured the spirit of the books quite as well. It's absolutely brilliant.
You can visualize everything so much better with those.
That is like, to me, imprinted as though it's outside here.
Okay, guys. All right. Thank you, everybody. Fantastic presentation. Lovely discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely.
One recommendation from what Benny said about going back home for the holidays or weddings and so on. Recommendation of a book of a friend written by a friend of ours called Aruna Nambiar, a book called Mango Cheeks, Metal Teeth. It's about a holiday spent in Kerala, rural Kerala, typical, what everybody has gone through. So please read it. Mango Cheeks, Metal Teeth by Aruna Nambiar. I've got a copy. I'll try and pass it around sometime when I'm going.
Has she written an earlier book?
Okay, great.
That's her first. She's written one later.
Okay, then maybe we read the later one.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, see ya. Thank you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.